Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. I am joined, as always, by Maggie Parke, who is, as always, somewhere else new in the bohemian existence that Maggie and her family are.
Bohemian and not hobo.
Like maybe it depends on the time of day. I don't know, but anyway, yeah, no, it's so glad that you could join us again in the midst of you. But I think things are moving towards
I feel
resolution.
Like before we get into adaptation discussion every week, I have to give you all an update on my living situation.
Right.
So we moved out of my sister-in-law's house. We moved into our rental house, and today we got the keys to our new house. So, guys, the UK housing market is no joke, but we got keys to our house today. So we went over to the house and just sat there and had a cup of tea and watched my kid run around and explore, and the dog was going crazy, and it was like, oh my god, this is our home. So it was really exciting.
Awesome. That's very cool.
So I hope to have things set up there fairly soon. That we will have wait till you see the ideas I have for the broadcast station I'm going to be making in this new home. Allie told me, my husband told me he's going to build me a hobbit hut in the back garden.
Nice. Very good. Very good.
Yeah.
That's when it's really a home, of course. When you have a nice little hobbit hut. When you have a hobbit.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Have a hobbit hut.
Yeah.
Anyway,
very
thank
cool.
You. I'm here.
Yes, here you are. We're glad you're here. So today we're going to continue. Got a little sidetracked last week, hard to believe, but we're gonna return to our discussion of the Peter Jackson adaptation, and we decided we're gonna go kind of laterally. We've been discussing the Fellowship of the Ring film, but we've talked about a lot of characters, but there are still important elements of the Fellowship of the Ring that we've not talked about yet. And that I think we should. So today we're going to talk about Legolas and Gimli. Now, one thing I have to say that I think to kind of frame the discussion from a text standpoint, right? Legolas in particular, Gimli also to a lesser extent, but Legolas principally. I think of all of the sort of major characters of the Lord of the Rings, right? Of all of he's a member of the Company of the Ring, right? I mean, he's one of the nine, very prominent. He is also, I think, by far the biggest black box of any of those characters. He is. They started with the cleanest slate with Legolas, I think, than they had with any of the other characters. There was you think about even sort of comparably kind of minor characters like Pippin, for instance, right? He's not Frodo and Sam, right? He's a sort of a second tier member of the company as far as the amount of narrative focus on him in the story. But Pippin has a strong character, right, from the beginning, a strong character and personality. Definitely something people would be going to the theaters and saying, are they going to get Pippin Took right? And even Merry Brandybuck, I think. But Legolas, I cannot imagine that there were very many people, very many Tolkien fans who went to the theaters saying I just pray to God they don't screw up Legolas, right? That's, I really can't imagine that was the case for almost anyone. I'm not saying that nobody likes Legolas. I'm not saying he's not interesting or important. I'm just saying that he doesn't have that kind of personal depth in the books. I mean, it's interesting because. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say on Tuesday, Tuesday of this week, we just were looking and exploring the Lord of the Rings at the passage where Legolas it's not the first time he speaks, but it's the first time he kind of comes out of the shadows and is given any glimpse of personality, basically. And that is when he walks on the snow. When he, and not only walks on the snow, but trolls everybody else about it. It's a significant moment. And so we were looking at one of the things that I think had was interesting that sort of emerged from that discussion on Tuesday is that the thing, and you can see it very prominently in the text at that moment, there's really a sense of what's important about him is not who he is. It's not his person. It's that he's an elf. right? I mean, he's kind of a token elf. Not token in the sense that like they have to have one and he fills the bill, but rather like that's what he's not. Legolas Greenleaf, son of Thranduil.
Right.
He's the elf.
Right.
In the party.
And has a few characteristics that are very token elf. You know, he has a few things that does set him apart. So when you look at the grand picture of the Fellowship, one looks different than the other. So I feel like visually that's a really important thing to have, ironically, in a text. But like it's nice to kind of show that variation and diversity in the crew. But I also didn't really feel that way when I was reading the books about Legolas, that he was underdeveloped by any means. He just wasn't deeply developed, if that makes sense. Like,
and most of and most of the attention that's given to him is given to him as being different because he's an elf, right?
Right.
Like
it's not because he's different, it's just because he's an elf.
Because he's an elf, right? Like, so his eyesight, right? The fact that he doesn't sleep, right? Like all these things. It doesn't tell you anything about Legolas personally. It just tells you about elves and how elves are different from everybody else. And since he's the only elf that we do more than visit, right? That we do more than just kind of check in on. Well,
I think that's what made it so. I mean, we'll get into the film, but I think that's what made him so fun as a film character, because I feel like there was a certain level of responsibility with other character development and necessity. Like, we had to get all these characters from A to B to C to D and had to care about each of those movements.
Right.
So to have a character from the text, not that you didn't care about Legolas, but he was just there.
Well, exactly. And for this reason, again, they had bigger scope with Legolas to develop him in almost whatever direction they want. I mean, there would have been directions they could have developed him in that would have like seemed weird, right? That would have been like more actively discordant with what with the roles that he has in the book. But again, they had I think pretty broad leeway to make of his character almost anything that they wanted. So doing with that kind of preamble from thinking about the relationship with the book, I don't want to break our own guidelines or ignore our own advice about how to approach adaptation, right? And just start off by going through point by point and comparing and contrasting with the book. Let's instead look at movie Legolas, right? And say, okay, what is the role of movie Legolas?
Yeah. Like when you think about developing that character, and they had a giant board in the front of the room with each of the 9 fellowship, which boxes were ticked under the Legolas column?
Yeah.
Like ethereal, definitely otherworldly, sexy, hot, androgynous. I mean, that was definitely
hot.
The call sheet of like,
hot
we gotta find somebody really stunningly gorgeous.
And that is interesting. I mean, of course, like, you can never fully. I'm sure that there are many times that film producers cast someone and they're like, oh, like this guy is going to be the next, teen heartthrob for the next 10 years, and it doesn't pan out, right? So these things are not always predictable in the effect. But nevertheless, I think it's pretty clear that one of the things they liked about Orlando Bloom in that role, though he was completely unknown as an actor, before that point, was, this guy is both enormously attractive and has great charisma, and so when they're filling the role, clearly those were things they were looking for the Legolas role, right?
And also, I just really liked how strikingly differently they styled him. He does look similar to the Wood Elves. You can see that kind of affinity and kinship there, but he has this the long blonde hair, the really stunningly beautiful face. He's not hot or sexy. He's beautiful. There's just this really lovely, that Orlando Bloom kind of looks like that, but Orlando Bloom was kind of hot. I mean, I was a teenager when these came out, so like Orlando Bloom was hot, right? And Legolas was beautiful. Like there is a difference there. So I feel like you're right. I mean, leans into the character.
That's a really good point. I mean, his costuming was not in any way designed to emphasize like his hot bod,
He
like
was not just a pinup,
yeah, yeah, exactly. You're right about like the beautiful face, right? And even the sort of affect, right? There was like they were going for, I don't know. It does seem to like elegance and beauty, right? Are what I want to,
Yes.
sort of say about
Measured,
that.
level, sculpted.
Yeah,
That's a good word.
Sculpted praise. I agree.
Yeah.
That kind of, and really playing that up. And again, and I think you're right to point out that costuming can make a huge difference here, right?
Totally.
I mean, had he, you could have dressed Legolas in such a way as to convey hot and sexy rather than sculpted and beautiful, right?
Well,
but that was a choice.
And even if you just flat compare him to like Rings of Power, Arondir has bare arms and that sculpted chest plate. He's not a sex symbol, but it's a very different choice than this wood elf that's clad in leather and braces and things like that. And even the Legolas choice versus the other wood elves who are in long velvet gowns. He's not wearing long velvet gowns. He's wearing this very functional attire so he can shoot his bow and arrow, so he can ride the trunk of the elephant. So he's a very active elf. Yeah,
exactly. No, I think that's. And by the way, as just to, at the risk of introducing a digression, but I think that we can see they made a very similar choice with Evangeline Lilly in the Hobbit films as far as her costuming was concerned, right? Evangeline Lilly was beautiful in the Hobbit movies, but she was not sexy. Like her clothing did not emphasize her body. Again, it was beautiful and sculpted rather than hot and sexy, again, with the female elf as well, which, by the way, is one of the things I always admired. In introducing a female character to the Hobbit films like they did, there was always my dread in approaching that was that, there was going to be some like slave Leia moment, right? Basically where they were going to try to amp up, just to add sex appeal to the story when you add a female character. And I was dreading that, and it didn't happen. I was really, I thought they handled that really respectfully. But again, the point is, to bring it back to relevance, we see them that's the trend that they established first with Legolas's character.
And you can see the reason in story why you would want that kind of draw. Like, of course you want that kind of tension of a romance, but this film didn't warrant just a sex symbol. It needed kind of the deeper levels that we see between Aragorn and Arwen and things like that. But excuse me, what I did love was that they really played with the other levels of intimacy in this group. And I feel like, I don't want to go off on too big of a tangent because I feel like this could be a whole other episode, but the relationship between Legolas and Gimli, the way that they could build that up and how they could draw that relationship on screen between these two warring factions into this tight-knit group. And also the brotherly relationship between Aragorn and Legolas, I absolutely loved in the film.
Yes.
Their ability to communicate with each other. It just, I absolutely love that you could see the depth, the history, all of that in their relationship. So having Legolas as kind of this like vanilla type character that they were able to mold was really well done and facilitated a lot of other storytelling that I think needed to happen for everybody else's arcs to work really well too. Yeah.
Oh, I agree. And I remember as a viewer, the very first thing that struck me about Legolas's character was that the presumed previous relationship with Aragorn, the way that he was brought in as a confidant almost relationship with Aragorn. Like his one close friend in the Fellowship, essentially. I mean, he knew Gandalf, right? I mean, it's not like they were strangers or something. But whereas, again, in the book, it's Gandalf and Aragorn who know each other best. Like, they're the ones with the longest standing relationship. Legolas is, of course, Phil is joking about the fact we made a lot of this. We were really amused by this in Exploring the Lord of the Rings. Legolas's first introduction in the book is he's called a strange elf. Just meaning an elf from out of town, primarily is what I believe it is conveying there. But yes, Legolas as the strange elf is has been kind of a running joke. But again, clearly in the book, he is from out of town. He is the outsider, and that again is one of his larger roles. He's the outsider because he's from Mirkwood and nobody knows him. Even Gimli has like a family connection anyway, right? Like he and Frodo are like second cousins, right? They're not. They're the descendants of close friends, right? Their dads were friends, so they're kind of connected in some way. Anyway, Legolas is the outsider, right? And the outsider because he's an elf as well. So, anyway, the way that Legolas is brought is connected with Aragorn from that moment he steps forward in the council. We see that, right? Both his standing up to defend,
son of Arathorn, exactly. Yeah. And the knowledge and the gravitas and all those things that he brings to it, like, oh, I'll listen to you, and I will now listen to him because I'm listening to you. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So it's a fascinating example of an initial framing choice that they give to Legolas's character. Right. From the beginning, he is, because of his connection with Aragorn, he belongs in a way. Like, if you see what I mean, like his fundamental relationship with the company is different. He's not the outsider. He's an insider. Insider more than many others are an insider. Even the hobbits are more outside than Legolas in some sense. Like he and Aragorn and Gandalf are the three who kind of know what's going on, right? Boromir is kind of an outsider. Gimli is kind of an outsider. The hobbits collectively are kind of outsiders, right? Or certainly they're the ones who are being kind of, I don't know. They're like the
roped in.
Yeah, exactly. They're
like Boromir's kind of seeking to be part of that center crew.
Yeah.
But he's not. Whereas the hobbits are just kind of being forced into that center crew.
Yes, exactly. Yep. Yeah.
And I love with Legolas the exchanges that they give him in the film. He has a really clear voice. Like, I feel like their character development with Legolas was very thoughtful, but also really real. It feels like a real person, a real character, which is so funny to say about this ethereal character that does have this gravitas and have this, ability to speak in the way that he speaks. But he also has like a little glint in his eye that he can, convey humor, and to have a very serious and skilled elf with all this knowledge and the weight of the world on his shoulders be able to convey humor in a quick look, that also gives a depth of character that, I don't know, it ages him in a good way to be like, wow, you're able to accomplish a lot in this one little glance. And I think they do that very well with him.
I agree. The one example of that comes to mind right away is right before the cave troll fight in Moria. When the orcs are coming in, right? The way in which Aragorn and Legolas together, like they both have bows, right? And there's this kind of glance that they don't even need to talk. They're like, okay, here we go, right? Let's, and the kind of the kind of unspoken coordination between the two of them, assessing the situation, knowing what has to happen. That was a moment where I felt like that nonverbal communication. He's very much, Legolas is depicted as being very much like one of the guys, right? Yeah. In a way which is again strikingly different from his sort of outsider status in the text.
I love that that's your reference point of that moment as a fight, and mine is the kiss with Arwen at the end of Aragorn when they're doing their arm on each other, brotherly glance, and then you just see Legolas's eyes go like this quickly to the side, and you're like, ooh, what's over there? And that's when he sees Arwen. So you have this kind of like, bro, your girl's here moment, that's
right.
It's quite sweet.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. No, and so with that in mind, then, the way in which the film, it's not that the film doesn't convey him though as other at all, or he's not like just one of the guys, because it's made clear from very early on that he can do stuff that other people can't do. Right. And of course, most of the famous stuff like this escalates over the course of the films. Right. You know, we get the shield surfing, and that moment when he like catches and swings himself onto the back of the galloping horse, right? Yeah. In the Two Towers.
Defies gravity.
Right, completely. Exactly. And then in the third film, of course, we have the Oliphant episode, episode, right? But even in the Fellowship of the Ring, we're already seeing this, right? We're already beginning to see him separated out for what, that he just, not only can he do things that others can't do, but like Aragorn assumes he can do things that others can't do.
Yeah, and he's the one that reveals that. So, we do get that moment of Legolas walking on the snow going into Moria, and what do your elf eyes see is what Aragorn yells out. So we have this moment where Legolas is doing some stuff that nobody else is capable of doing right now, and Aragorn treats it as normal and a facility of their crew that can strengthen their opportunity, so it's just a tool that's it's very normalized to him.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And
which makes it that much more magical to us. If it's normal to him, we're like, this is
right.
The right
and
way.
It like indirectly elevates Aragorn because of how normal it is to him, right? And also his leadership ability, right? That the sense that he has not just a friend, but he has like somebody he can deploy in this way, right? Somebody he can be, yeah.
And in a trustworthy way too, like really seems to have a high level of regard for him and trusts him.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think about, for instance, the troll fight again in Fellowship of the Ring. I'm thinking about in Fellowship of the Ring specifically. I'm trying to think of like where in the film Legolas's physical abilities are first distinguished for us, like where he stands out. One is he's the one who identifies the Crabine, isn't he?
Yeah.
Crabine from Dunland, right? He's the one who identifies the birds. Then
that might have been the first.
The walking on the snow.
And he can see it first too. So it's not just that he knows the name and who they are and what they're doing, but he knows it's not just a wisp of cloud.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then so that
walking on the snow.
And then the walking on the snow. I think that those are the first two moments where, and the walking on the snow is the most dramatic early moment of he's different from everybody else, like categorically, even weirdly different from everybody else. And then we see, following that up in the troll fight, is the first time we see him do things, right, that like normal people can't do. The way he walks across the chain, he's the one who gets the kill shot in on the troll, right, because of walking along the chain, right? And I'm just thinking about the
snow shot now too, like, in terms of visual storytelling. It's not just that he was walking on top of a fresh coat of snow. The others were struggling and fighting and sinking, and it was waist deep snow. They were really not doing well, and the hobbits aren't going to survive this. They were under the snow being carried and things like that. And his hair wasn't even blowing the wrong direction.
Right, he's just strolling.
Yes. He was fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was, I would say breaking a sweat, but it was snow, but he wasn't ruffled in the slightest.
Yeah. Unaffected by the things which are they're being an almost insurmountable barrier to everybody else. Yeah.
And I think that's a real strength of the visuals, that in a text you might read, he walked on top of the snow and go, wow, that's crazy. And then you see it and you're like, dang, so it just hits a little bit stronger.
Yeah. It puts him in a different category with those things. And so, and it's fascinating that they achieved the balance that they did between like making him one of the guys and yet differentiating him successfully in those kinds of ways. It's interesting that they attempted to do both of those things.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating how well that worked, to do both of those things.
I do wonder how much freedom they gave to the actors at all, if any, in the process, because it really does feel like, I'm thinking specifically about Legolas and Pippin. I feel like they really leaned into the humor side of these characters, and the actors themselves are quite comical. So I wonder if there was an element of, we're going to let you kind of embrace this character and see where it goes.
Yeah, Gimli too. I wonder how much John Rhys Davies, and his personality, kind of helped to shape the direction of Gimli's character.
I have this lingering tickling cough, guys. It's going to be a doozy. Woo!
Sorry about
I'll just
that.
mute myself from time to time. You can blame my toddler. I got her cold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, okay. We talked, thinking about Legolas still. We've talked about like elements of his characterization. Let's talk about his role in the story, especially in the Fellowship of the Ring. And it's hard restricting it there because his prominence grows over the course of the films. And some of the things we've talked about definitely are part of his role in the story, like to be Aragorn's reliable confidant. I mean, Legolas is pretty much Aragorn's right-hand guy through the whole film, especially because Legolas is always with Aragorn, right? The two of them are never separated until the very, very end of the story, in the book. So, therefore, having him be Aragorn's right-hand guy is, I think, an important element of his role in the story. But what else? What else do we think they accomplish with him?
We've got this like bro kind of relationship. We've got this confidant, trusted training partner, armed services kind of relationship of ability to trust, but also skill. But there's also this like diplomatic role that he fulfills that I didn't necessarily get from the text. So if we are quick comparison, but I think that's an important role for him to play in the film, because it does play into the world building of Middle Earth, that we have these different races with this intense history, and now we have a bridge. This character is willing to be that bridge, but he's not like, I will be a bridge. He just is a bridge. And the fact that the three of them, the man, the dwarf, and the elf, well, kind of man, get separated off and have this relationship, I feel like that, I'm trying to find a nice way to articulate it, but it's not something that I got from the text. And it's something that really grew into my love of the film, is the relationships that they were able to illustrate and the different races and how that works together.
Yeah, the emphasis on I think side point, but I think it relates to this. One of the interesting things that I think is a fun kind of accident of history here is the phrase, the Fellowship of the Ring, right? So Tolkien doesn't use that phrase almost at all. Like he comes to eventually, but the moment in the film when Elrond is like, you are the Fellowship of the Ring, right?
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah. That does not happen. That never happens. They're called the Company of the Ring. The word fellowship doesn't actually come up much or at all, certainly as a kind of quasi title for their group, until the title of the breaking of the fellowship.
Right.
Aragorn uses the word at Parthgalen. He says, "What shall come now?" Because it's decision time. Are we going to go to Mordor? Are we going to go to Minas Tirith? Are we going to split up? What's going to happen? And so Aragorn uses the word and says, like, what shall become of our company, which has traveled so long in fellowship, right?
But traveled so long in fellowship is different than being called a fellowship.
Exactly. It's not a band name, right? Mm-mm. Like it isn't like that at all. And then even later, even at the end, like, so at last Gandalf says at the Grey Havens comes the end of our fellowship in Middle Earth. And even there, he's not talking about the whole fellowship, because Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, they're not there, right? It's just the hobbits and Gandalf. He's talking
about the word fellowship. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
In the common sense.
Yeah. So, again, it's not that it isn't, and of course Tolkien chose the title, but we have to remember, this is what I mean by accident of history. The phrase Fellowship of the Ring becomes such a big deal because it's the title of the first book, right? So when pressed to it, and again, very, very brief, I promise, historical lecture, Tolkien, of course, this was always one book, right? The Lord of the Rings was always a single book in Tolkien's mind, but it's a single, very long book divided into 6 parts, right? And so, of course, it's an accident of history in the sense that his publisher was saying, this is a weird book anyway, and I don't know how people are going to be put off by a 1,000-page book on the shelf, right? But also, it was immediately post-World War II, and paper was enormously scarce and very, very expensive in the post-war years. So he was like, what we would have to charge for this book, because paper is, it's like no one would be able to buy it. We're going to price it out of everybody's price range. And so for these reasons, his publisher insisted that they split it up into 3 volumes and publish them separately so that they'd be shorter and more affordable. And so Tolkien was pressed well after he had finished writing it, like long after the book was finalized, to come up with titles for the 3 different volumes, which he had never, ever envisioned. And so that's where the Fellowship of the Ring comes in. He did choose that. And no, Phil, he doesn't ever title the 6 books, the 6 different parts of the Lord of the Rings itself. But anyway, he chose the Fellowship of the Ring. Like that was his title, but it's like his last second title. Now, that still doesn't mean nothing. He's still looking back over these 2 things. He's like, I think, if I, being pressed to give a title to the first 2 books of this, together, I'm going to call it The Fellowship of the Ring. But it's very much like his assessment after the fact, right? It's not an organic,
purposeful.
It's certainly, it's not used like a proper noun that's used organically within the story. Whereas, since, of course, they were obviously beginning with that title in filmmaking, the film foregrounds, the Fellowship and the Fellowship theme, and we can probably all hum in unison the Fellowship musical theme from Howard Shore's score, right? We all know, like, the Fellowship
theme. I didn't have a cold, guys.
Yeah. Anyway, like, it's so...
Yeah, it's just there.
This is it's made a really, really central element, I think, very appropriately. Like, it's perfectly fine. All of this is coming back to what you were saying before about the elf, dwarf, human thing, and how you felt like it was emphasized more in the film than it was emphasized in the book, and I completely agree. The book does show an interesting conglomeration of different peoples who are all working together, but because there isn't that parallel moment that, like, and you shall be called the Fellowship. I'm going to give you a band name now, and the name of your band shall be the Fellowship of the Ring, right? They don't have a group identity. In fact, it's very noticeable when they leave Rivendell in the book. They're all traveling together. They're all the company of the ring for now, but they're not all on the quest. Like, it's Legolas and Gimli are only going with them because they're volunteering to go a little bit out of their way on the way home to keep them company for some of the journey. Boromir is headed to Minas Tirith, which is in the same direction. And so is Aragorn. Aragorn and Boromir are only along because they're going to Minas Tirith, and that's in the same direction as Mordor for most of the way. So they're coming along too.
It's a hitch and a ride.
Right. but there's no sense. And Merry and Pippin and Sam are there because Frodo is there, and so they're they want to come with him and help him. But there's no moment. There's no commissioning moment, right, where everybody is brought together and we're told, like, okay, now this is now who you are. This is now what you are. And of course, by having that explicit commissioning moment, introducing that explicit commissioning moment in the film, it foregrounds this element, right? Because they aren't given just any band name. The band name that they're given is the Fellowship of the Ring, and that's something they have to live up to. They have to grow into. And so, like, can they all work together? Can they gain respect for each other? Can this motley group composed of these, 4.5 different races, however you count Gandalf in there, is like, will they be able to come together and really act as a fellowship? And that process is what we see. The music foregrounding, right, with the fellowship theme that surges up, right, whenever they act together and work properly and all that kind of thing. And so yes, it really is foregrounded.
And it's such a great challenge to the word, almost, like, will you be the fellowship? And they're taking that up. I'm saying they as in filmmakers. The filmmakers are taking up that challenge by saying, we are going to make you care about every single element of these characters and every single moment of this story, because we have, what's the total running time? 14 hours or something? Like, we have a lot of time that you're going to spend with these people, and there have to be a lot of rising action moments and climactic moments. So for those to hit, for those to land emotionally and, pacing wise and everything else, you got to care about the people leading up to it. So what a great challenge to take the word fellowship and then look at these drivers of the story and make them work together individually, in small groups, in the big picture. Like, I would just love to see the mind maps that they had to create, and I'm sure that's something similar to what Rings of Power is doing now, but they have the different challenge of a little bit of audience knowledge, a little bit of expectation, and trying to make all of that fit together but still tell a really good story.
But you're right. I mean, I'm coming back to the point that you made before, and it about Legolas being a bridge, like one of his primary roles in the film being a bridge. Because if you think about it, he is, on the one hand, like, there are two different roles that he plays in this whole fellowship theme, right? Which is so central, especially to that first film. On the one hand, he is already the positive example of what should be. Him and Aragorn, right, are already this, like, multi-ethnic partnership, right? That's the, like, everybody should grow to be as close and to trust each other and work together as well as Legolas and Aragorn already do. Right.
They're totally the poster children for that, but they also grew up together, So I feel
I'm not saying it was hard, but anyway, like that's the goal.
You can't really aspire to that. Right. That's more of like an exemplar, right?
Yeah, exactly. But of course, on the other hand, he also is the primary, like, the greatest success of bridging a gap. Him and Gimli, right? The friendship between Legolas and Gimli becomes the model for, like, what can happen when you accept this whole fellowship thing, right? And like, it's like both a kind of, he and Aragorn are sort of like the framing example, right? Like, this is like the aspirational example, while at the same time he's also like, and here's like what success looks like, right? When you're doing it with even elves and dwarves can do this. And so in that way, and the fact that Legolas is in both of those, right? He's in both the foundational bedrock exemplary relationship with Aragorn, and he's also in the success story one with Gimli. Again, bridge, he's being a bridge in that way. So
and I think, if I don't know, I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are too on the relationship of Gimli and Aragorn, if we're going to talk about that, because you would think, if Gimli respected Aragorn so much and he saw the relationship between Aragorn and Legolas, then he'd be open to a better relationship with Legolas. But I never got this super strong feeling that there was a massive amount of respect is the wrong word, between Aragorn and Gimli. Not that he disrespected Aragorn, but it was a bit indifferent to Aragorn. And I think that that kind of symbiotic relationship between the three of them had to work for Legolas and Gimli to function.
Yes.
But
Yes.
I think the Aragorn and Gimli relationship bears a little bit of attention too, but I don't know if you want to go off on that tangent or not.
It does, and it certainly we're well past time when it would have been good to shift to Gimli anyway. So let's talk about Gimli a little bit more. Because the thing that I see involved...
back to Legolas too. There's still a lot. Don't worry. But
but yeah, no, the thing that I see when I think of Gimli's sort of starting point, and we'll come to the Gimli as comic relief element, because obviously that's a very prominent thing. But thinking about it in the terms that you were just asking about, one of the things that I think is most important about Gimli, he's proud, even arrogant, right? He is overcoming, his friendship with Legolas is overcoming his own prejudices. Not only his anti-elf prejudices, but even his pro-dwarf prejudices, right? Gimli in the film is always fiercely proud of being a dwarf and what that means. And so when you were talking about the respect or the disrespect that he had for Aragorn, I agree. I don't think there was anything personal there. I don't think that they tried to convey that Gimli had, for some particular reason, a low opinion of Aragorn. But just, he did not automatically respect him, because I don't think he automatically respects anybody. I mean, he seemed to be the person, the Gimli character in the film seemed to be the one who has this sort of attitude of, he has a high opinion of himself, of what it means to be a dwarf. Like he's almost like a dwarf snob.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like he Phil, that's a really interesting point. Our introduction to Gimli's character is, then what are we waiting for? I'm going to hack at the ring with my axe to destroy it. Right.
Right.
And even that shows, I mean, think about what that action implies about him. Right. First of all, it implies that he is, he didn't do anything without consulting anybody, but like, when the general sentiment seems to be towards like it would be good for the ring to be destroyed, he immediately takes it upon himself, not just to suggest it, not just to vote for it, but to do it. Like, we're not going to make a decision. We're not going to, like, okay, fine. I'm going to take this on myself. Yeah, exactly. So the fact that he thought he had some kind of like right to act that way.
Diplomacy was not his.
Yeah, it's enormously presumptuous, right? Yeah. And of course, futile in the end, but still, like, he didn't know that. And that's the other thing, right? High opinion of himself in the sense that, having decided, like, well, if we think destroying the ring is a good thing to do, I'm obviously just ready to do that in a heartbeat. And I also am going to assume that if I hit something with my axe, it's going to be destroyed because I'm a dwarf and it's my axe, so, so anyway, I mean, I do think that, I mean, those are the first things that we see, about Gimli. And of course he's also in this way a bit of a fool, right? And from that very first scene, he doesn't come off great. I mean, in the end, he looks like a bit of an idiot, right? For thinking that think about Elrond's careful non-eye roll when he's responding, it cannot be destroyed by, like it's, sit
down, Gimli. Yeah, that's.
Yeah. Exactly. So, anyway, we do with Legolas have the specific elf dwarf prejudices in place, right? And that's something that they play up, though less than they might, actually. I mean, I thought that was actually relatively understated, that they, the elf dwarf,
I'm trying to think if there was even
prejudice.
A specific moment where they discuss it, or is it just always
it comes up
inferred?
It comes up at the council, right? Though, like, I'll be dead before I see the ring in the hands of an elf thing.
But we don't know why. I mean, we don't have like the historical recap. We just know there's a big old issue because they keep saying, elf dwarf situations.
Right, right. Yes, there's a there. Where else do we see it? We get the
I
moments
never
of
thought I'd be
conflict.
fighting. Never thought I'd be fighting side by side with a dwarf. Or how about with a friend?
Right. But
You know?
that's like the resolution of it, right?
Yes.
How does it get established leading up to
Yeah.
that? Exactly.
There's not a lot. There's the drinking scene, but that's more of a pub challenge and showing off, like I almost called him Elrond, Legolas's skills and imbibing. Yeah, there's not a lot, is there?
No, it's I mean, I think it is established, but it's pretty understated. I'm having a hard time putting my finger on a moment in the film
Oh
where
yeah,
they're
Nameless
really.
Arcanum. Legos makes a snotty comment about the smell, right? And he says something about I could smell him coming, or no, I could hear him coming. That was in Lothlorien. The
Yeah,
dwarf
yeah, yeah. You're
breathes so
right, right. The,
loudly.
the, the dwarf breathes so loud we could shoot him in the
Yeah.
dark. Yeah, yeah. It is
What does
true that
Legolas
the
say in Moria?
the build up to the build up to Lothlorien, like, foregrounds Gimli's general distrust of elves, which of course then gets, you know, put out the window
Galadriel.
when he meets Galadriel. Yeah, it
Yeah,
gets
he
Galadrieled.
he, he gets Galadriel.
Yeah, and of course, in the book, um, uh, in the book, the turning point in their friendship is Lothlorien. And it's funny because it happens like totally off stage. All we're told is that Legolas, because they're among elves, right? And the company lives in this, like, they get this like pavilion that's set up, and that's where they live together. And they don't like hang out with the elves all the time. Like, they don't go anywhere. But Legolas does. Like, he's like among his people, right? So we're told that he often goes off and hangs out with the elves. And then there's just that one sentence in which we're told, and like surprisingly, Gimli went with him often. And so like they had lots of hang time in Lothlorien, and then after that they're friends. And the film does echo that. I mean, think about the
Yeah.
conversation that Legolas and Gimli have in the boat about the gifts, right? When we
Mhm.
get the flashback to the gifts in the extended edition. And Gimli, of course, is talking about the hairs from Galadriel's head that he got and stuff. But the whole tone of that conversation of
Yeah.
them together is like, there's like quiet confidence. There's an easiness
And
between the two of them.
yeah, there's a real comfort. Like that's a
Yeah.
really vulnerable thing for Gimli to share because 100% Legolas should be mocking him for that, right? And making fun of him, but there's none of that. So that has become a stronger relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Um, yeah. Yeah. So I'm trying to remember lines of tension between the, like, that point that were showing rivalry or distrust between the two of them. Um,
The ones that there are so subtle and they're definitely more general, not personal.
mhm.
You know, you get the feeling that they've grown up in these races that are feeling that way about each other. So that shows us something about their communities and cultures. But the actual interactions, it's not like, oh, Legolas, you're a snotty little,
Right.
it's so much more about his people, not about him. So once they
Right.
realize the person's all right, I guess you're all right. We'll hang out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think
It
the way
is.
they deliver that pacing wise is really well handled in Jackson's trilogy. So by the time we do get the humor, which I know is divisive, I'm very happy to talk about that.
Yeah.
But by the time we do get the humor, it doesn't feel like a gag or it doesn't feel trite. It feels like a natural progression of their relationship. I think a lot of people don't like that that was the progression of their relationship, but
Yeah,
it
it's
didn't
interesting
feel
actually.
fake.
The moments. Okay, so let's talk about Gimli and humor.
Yeah.
Gimli and comic relief. I will say categorically, the times when Gimli and any other character are giving each other a hard time, and it's funny, are by far the least objectionable. I mean, like, or would you rather I get you a box? Is a
Yeah.
great line. Like that's a
Such
great
a great
line.
line.
And
Such a great line.
I don't. The problem, if I had to point to the scene, so there's the dwarf tossing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, which by the way, there you go. Don't tell the elf, right?
Yeah.
But again, even that is after the friendship. That's not really a prejudice thing. But anyway,
But that shows that he still cares about face value too. You know, like,
right,
don't tell me else. I just
right,
don't. Let me have this. Yeah.
right, right. So even more than the dwarf, the nobody tosses a dwarf humor in the Fellowship of the Ring. The moment which for me embodies the elements of comic relief I dislike in Gimli's character is the "we dwarves are natural sprinters" moment.
Okay.
Like Gimli tumbling and falling around in ways which honestly strain my suspension of disbelief in that moment. Like we're being the film and the helicopter shots and everything, right, are inviting us there at the beginning of the Two Towers to believe that these three companions together are, running across the country and pursuing the orcs and keeping up with them, and like what they accomplish together is supposed to be a feat, just a feat of physical stamina, which makes people awed when they hear about it, right? And yet we have, Gimli. At the same time, I'm told that Gimli is puffing and panting and falling over because he can't keep up. And I'm like, how, with Legolas and Aragorn running as we're shown them running, wouldn't they have to stop and sit down and wait every 5 minutes for Gimli to catch up? If this were the case, like I said, it strains the. I feel like the film is asking me to believe two totally contradictory things at the same time. That the three of them together are effectively able to follow the orcs, while at the same time I'm being asked to believe that Gimli is
Not
an incompetent clown.
Mm.
I don't know. I mean, if they had not done anything like that, it might have strained disbelief in the other direction, perhaps. Like if we had seen nothing other than John Rhys Davies looking like chariots of fire, running across, that would have been comical, unintentionally comical in a different way. And so maybe the thought is just, since you're probably going to laugh at the visual spectacle of this dwarf as, sprinting for hours and keeping up with them, we might as well make it deliberately funny so that your laughter is channeled rather than laughing at something that we're asking to take you to take seriously.
That's a nice way to think of it, and not just we need a gag here. But I can see all sides of that, but I have to say that never stuck out to me. So that scene also wasn't that impactful to my overall evaluation of these relationships or individual characters.
The reason that I single that out is that he's not interacting with any other characters, right? This is just Gimli's character clowning for the camera, right? So this is just a way that they're presenting Gimli's character solo, right?
Yeah.
And doing so in such a way as to sort of undermine our assessment of his capabilities, right?
Yeah.
And this is a frequent thing with Gimli, right? He's always talking big and coming up small, right? He's now he's not just a buffoon. Like they don't make him wholly incompetent. I mean, he is. We don't get the line in the film in the book, the never have I seen an axe so wielded, which is the comment of Theoden? Aragorn? Who is it? Who says that? I'm blanking. In the Battle of Helm's Deep. I'm totally blanking. Aemir? I can't remember.
Aemir?
Somebody look it up for me. It's bothering me. Who says that? But in any case, Gimli he's not useless completely, but he's never as impressive as. But he's always talking a bigger game than he can do. You know, and the comedy is always. So no, it's not. The line is not when Gimli sneaks out to help them. That's not when the never have I seen an axe so wielded line. That comes from the report of the battle afterwards. I believe at the moment when they're separated, and Legolas is looking for him. There it is. Thank you, JJ. I hoped you would come up with that. It is Aragorn. If he wins back to the caves, he will pass your count again. He says to Legolas, "Never did I see an axe so wielded." Yeah, Aragorn says it in the battle of Helm's Deep. Okay, I knew it was at that moment of separation, but I couldn't remember if it was Aragorn or somebody else. Okay, it is.
Somebody would have the answer for you. Well done.
Thank you. Yeah. I love people with searchable e-texts to hand.
Yes.
Boy, talk about things that have changed the world of being a scholar. Can you remember the old days when you used to have to look up a reference that you couldn't quite place? And
I mean,
I know
was
somebody said this, but oh man.
Yeah, I was right at the cusp of that happening, but oh man, the amount of times you had to thumb through pages to look for a specific word.
Oh man, I wasted hours and hours and hours of my life in graduate
Same with
school
automatic formatting of footnotes. Once that was introduced,
my goodness. Yeah. Phew.
I spent months formatting footnotes.
Yes. And bibliographies. Good grief.
The worst. Anyway, I like what you're saying. This makes a huge amount of sense in my mind because everything about Gimli's humor is about his sense of humor, and he's funny and has these dry, witty, clever moments. But those are examples. That's an example of him being made fun of.
Right. We are asked to laugh at Gimli, not with him a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why
not as much as in the Hobbits. It's less painful than the Hobbit films. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. They lean into the buffoonery with the Hobbits with the dwarves much more in the Hobbit films, and in some different ways. But yes, with Gimli, we are being asked to laugh at him quite a bit. And the interesting thing, though, coming back to what we were talking about before, about bridges between races and the importance of the fellowship. It is also interesting that Gimli is one of the only characters that we're invited to laugh at, not with. There are very few of the good guys that we're invited to laugh at. He is certainly the most consistent one. Even Pippin and Merry, we are laughing with rather than at most of the time.
Right.
As I think with Pippin, so Phil and Nemos aren't camera asking about Pippin, because Pippin is himself laughing. Pippin doesn't take himself seriously.
And we're not asked to take Pippin seriously.
Yeah.
We're not
Gimli.
We're not asked to think of him as a buffoon, but he's childlike. He's innocent. He's humor. Whereas Gimli is a leader. He's skilled.
And thinks very highly of himself. Highly of himself. So yes, even and many of the things that Pippin says that are funny are he intends them to be it's him cutting up, you know?
Yeah.
Pippin is
wisecrack.
Yeah. Pippin acts out. Not necessarily just in order to be funny, but he's not. It's not the same. And again, the way it's different with Gimli is the disjunction between his own self-image and it is when he thinks most highly of himself that we are laughing at him. right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, that's another thing that jumps out at me about that sprinting moment, is that like in the moment when he is looking like a buffoon, like he can't keep up with everybody else, is the very moment that he is insisting that dwarves are natural, dwarves are wasted on cross country, we dwarves are natural sprinters. Like he's trying to justify himself by, and again, like, is he joking? Is he serious? I don't think he's joking. I don't think he's exactly either one. But he's not just making a joke. He's not asking you to laugh with him in that moment.
And the filmmakers aren't either. I mean, that's a real decision. They're making that moment so you laugh at him. So that's a tough distinction to make. So I fully support that one now.
Yeah, well, and John Rhys Davies, and again, we were talking about, to what extent the actors kind of fit into this, right? I mean, John Rhys Davies clowns really well. Like, he many people have this talent of just like inviting you to laugh at them, right? And that
he does
can
it in such a
really
smart
disarming.
way.
Yes.
And he does it in such a smart way that you feel like you're sitting at the table of comedic genius, or the fact that he's got the Shakespearean voice and all these other things that kind of draw you into participating in that humor. You want to just laugh along with him. But the laughing at him is the separation. Right.
And again, like getting people to laugh at you, I mean, that's a totally viable stage and screen skill, right? Think of how many people's careers have been wholly premised at getting people to laugh at them, right? But anyway, it's so it's not him acting as a fool, like literally in a Shakespearean sense. It's the fact that Gimli is turned into a fool. This is the thing. Again, this is. I mean, I think this makes, like, if you were to make a top 10 list of things that annoy Tolkien fans about the Peter Jackson films, I think Gimli being made into a fool, into a clown, is going to be on almost everybody's top 10 list. Somewhere.
So why is it that one is more infuriating? People seem to be more vocal about the Oliphant.
Oh,
why?
More vocal about the absurdity of Legolas and the Oliphant.
When I think it now feels like they should really be more personally offended by this element.
I think it's a different thing. I think the Oliphant is just like it went too far.
It rides the line of gimmick, It's just I mean, I loved it. It was fun. It was fun. To have that moment. Agree. Just you have to suspend and just be like, "That was silly."
Right.
But I can totally see if like that was silly,
Right. Yes. I mean, you think about the progression, especially, right? Like running along the chains and shooting the cave troll in the head, to shield surfing at Helm's Deep, to Oliphant slaying.
Oliphant surfing.
Right. There's a clear escalation, right? Yeah. Not only in how Legolas's character is being presented in his physical abilities, but what we're supposed to be like down with, right?
Yeah.
And I think people complain about the Oliphant because it just went too far. Like I think they, it escalated beyond where people were comfortable being. Because think about, to cite another example of, in a sense, further escalation. Right, the Legolas can levitate by jumping off of rocks that are falling. Like that moment when he's running across a bridge, which is actually in the middle of collapsing and defying gravity. Right, in the Hobbit films, that was like way, way too far. You
have to work within the rules of physics.
Well, yeah. I mean, people just exactly what you said about the Oliphant. Like, okay, that was cool, but I have to work really hard to suspend disbelief. Like, I am conscious of the effort that I have to exert to suspend disbelief. But the Hobbit film thing was not only further in that direction, but it wasn't even cool, and it was like I
Yeah.
didn't want to suspend disbelief in that moment, right?
You know, I felt that way a little bit about the horse element when it defies gravity to swing himself up on a horse. I had to watch that multiple times because it was the first time we'd seen an effect like that on screen. And I thought it was interesting and cool how they made it look so real, but it didn't work. You know, and now I'm obsessed with, I'm sure everybody here knows, of the corridor crew and these VFX artists that talk about how a shot is made. And I can just hear them in my head watching that scene, going back and through, being like, here's why it doesn't work. And you can break it down and look at the different techniques that they used. And now I can only imagine that they would work with physics to make him launch onto a horse like a vaulter is capable of doing, where the wrist doesn't snap at 90 degrees, you know, and make that more believable. So then it becomes this awe-inspiring thing because that could happen. But immediately I'm like, that couldn't happen. So it takes you out of the story. And that's a fine line.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that the kind of the struggles that people have with things like the horse scene and with the Oliphant scene are of a different kind of order. And I completely agree with Nameless Arcanum on Twitch here. And we can see both the Twitch and YouTube comments, by the way. That one of the other problems is Gimli's the only dwarf in the whole film. And so therefore to have the only dwarf in the film be a clown means that like you're just laughing at dwarfs. There's nowhere is like, there are a lot of people out there who love Tolkien's dwarves, right? Lots of huge dwarf fans out there, and the film gives them so little. Because what the primary, almost exclusive representative in the film is, I don't want to say just comic relief, because Gimli never is merely comic relief, but he is, but he is a clown, a consistent clown.
And he's also kind of the safe conduit for humor. So, like, when you need a moment of levity in a scene, it's most likely going to come from him or Pippin. And those are two different styles of comedy.
Yeah.
So, depending on what the scene requires, you've got these two tools that you can wheel out. But that means that it's being wheeled out. So that means that is his shtick. That means that is, you know, his identifier. And if that's the only dwarf that you have, then you're going to make an assumption about that entire race based off of this representative. Which is tough. There was like another dwarf or two at Council of Elrond, right? But they never said anything. They never did anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
right.
it.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's not that there was never another dwarf on stage, but
they didn't do anything. They were representatives.
Yeah, they didn't do anything. They were there in the background once and then never again. And I mean, the whole trilogy. I mean, it was not there were no. Whereas again with Legolas, he's our primary elf, but there's lots of other elves all over the place in the story, and so
lots and lots of representations of their culture and their communities too. The only one we have of the dwarves is dead and decaying.
Right, is Moria. Exactly. Yes.
I can see exponentially now the love of our friend Varking that has of dwarves and Rings of Power, because they're amongst my favorite elements of Rings of Power completely.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. Thinking about the thing from the other side, right? On the top 10 list, I think of like best things about the Rings of Power. I think for everybody, it is the dwarves and the depiction of Khazad-dûm.
And the music.
So, yeah. So that was, it's hard. I don't, to some extent, there's a certain amount of like it's unfortunate, like the way it worked out, like the combination of events, right? That like the character of Gimli that they had, and that he was already kind of inclined towards this, like, well, I actually never finished this other thought. Back to the fellowship thing, right? If you think about it, the fellowship has to come together, and there are obstacles to the fellowship coming together. But there's almost nobody who has a voice which is like an elitist voice, right? almost nobody actually voices the sentiment, well, I'm not going to lower myself to be in a fellowship with you people, right? Which is obviously one of the things that has to be overcome. Like that kind of feeling would have to be overcome in order to make them into a fellowship. Gimli actually does voice that comically, right? Again, I think he's the most arrogant and stuck-up member of the fellowship. I mean, like, he's the only one who is like, my culture is superior and all that, and I'm going to go on and on endlessly and boringly about, like, how awesome we are and how improbably fantastic everything about dwarves is, right? And that, whenever he does that, that is undermined, right? Part of the comical effect is to undermine his own inclination towards arrogance and elitism, right? And that's one of the, and that is, it is effective in the fellowship storytelling, right? The forging of the fellowship storytelling. Anyways, yeah. So I think I don't think it's a horrible idea to have him be funny, even in a clownish, even to invite us to laugh at him instead of with him. But then you also combine the factor of, like, it's John Rhys Davies and he's really, really good at clowning and making us laugh at him. But then the fact that, the downside of all of this is that he's the only dwarf. And so therefore, the cost, or I always talk about costs and benefits, right? The cost of that move, there were great benefits to that move, but the cost of that move is now we've marginalized dwarves completely, right?
Yeah.
And there are a lot of criticism, or even criticisms that I would still have of the films, which I personally have to put into the category of, it's a cost. It's an expensive cost, right? I mean, there are some of these costs are rather dear, but that doesn't even necessarily mean that I think it's not a choice they should have made. It's just, I can't help but notice how expensive that was, right?
Yeah.
But and this is where I think so many times people, in thinking about adaptations, are sort of frankly unfair, right? Like, it's easy to take individual elements and say, oh, that could have been better. Like, oh, I would have done that. But what would have been the consequence of that change? If you had not done it the way that they did it, if you had made Gimli into, like, epic, awesome dwarf and everyone is admiring his awesomeness all the time, what would have been the cost? That would have come with a cost too. What would have been the cost, right? And you got to think that through. And is that cost actually less than the cost of what we see? It's not really, you can't just in a vacuum say, oh, I'd have done that better.
Yeah, and that's not invalidating, your opinions of what you think you could do either, because that's the power of adaptation. Like, you could tell that story differently. Isn't that amazing? You could tell that story differently.
Yeah.
But the fact is that you have to think of it like a symphony. You can't take one instrument out because the rest won't sound right. So, being able to play that game and pull at those different tensions and make a beautiful story. There's going to be moments where somebody's playing out of tune. It's amazing how often we compare this to music, but it works. Yeah. But occasionally somebody will play out of tune because just something isn't quite right with whatever just happened in that moment, but the entire symphony is still going to be a beautiful piece of music. So I don't want us to sound like we're saying the Peter Jackson trilogy is perfect. We're saying these decisions made sense, and I can see why they did it. That part I didn't like, but I can work with that,
Right.
So it's just kind of working yourself through that.
It's one of the things. So, like, everyone, I think, almost everyone would admit that these movies are great movies. Like, even people who are like, I don't like them. I'm a Tolkien fan. I've never liked them, but, like, they were great movies. Like, they're very, very successful movies. Not just in the sense of being randomly popular for some reason, but of being really powerfully effective.
Awards,
works
cinema.
of cinema. Yeah. So obviously, when we're looking at the choices that they made and weighing the costs and benefits of the choice that they made, well, the benefits are going to win most of the time. I mean, and this for me is one of the things that I think I'm really, really interested about. Right. JJ says, I think you're correct because Christopher Tolkien is no longer able to speak up. Right. Yeah, you're right. Now the
There's that.
right, he would not have agreed. But yeah, no, it's. Here's the thing that I find so fascinating, and this is one of the reasons why, for me, it's so useful to think through the Peter Jackson films in the kind of detail that we've been doing. Because when I anatomize, when I compare and contrast, when I go down the list, right? It's funny that you just felt you had to say at the end, we're not saying these films are perfect, right? Because when I'm talking about the Peter Jackson films on my own, I mostly have to end my episode by saying, now, I'm not trying to say they sucked. Like, it's not like, don't get the impression that I just hate them, because I really don't, right? Yeah. Because, again, when I'm simply comparing with the text, and I'm saying, like, okay, what is Tolkien doing in these moments? What are the films doing at these moments? I'm continuously being like, oh yeah, no, I think that was a poor choice. So, I'm trying to be fair, but that was also a poor choice. Like, there's so many, like, item by item, I'm like, yeah. I don't like it there's so many things I still don't like about it as an adaptation. And yet, thinking it through this way helps me to, like, how is the whole better than the sum of the parts, right? Like, how do we, when really thinking about it and when trying to frame it in these different terms, rather than taking these, like, a particular character, a particular incident in a vacuum, right? And trying to say, how are they doing and what are they doing? I think it's really interesting to be thinking through these kinds of choices that they're making and looking at how all those choices fit together. Because it's true, when we think about it in those terms, those cost benefit choices that you're always having to make in adaptation. Even if I feel like, they're missing the boat there. No, they're missing the boat there. The whole really does stand up really well, not just as a movie, but even as an adaptation of Tolkien. But again, I feel like that's, the more in the weeds you get, the less you are really thinking about the film as a film, the film on its own terms. The more you think about it that way, the easier it becomes to appreciate.
It's the challenge and the curse of the filmmakers too, of like, if I make this change, I'm going to take the fan out of the story because they're going to recognize it. And taking them out of the story is the biggest risk you can run, because then you go into analysis mode and not into enjoyment mode.
Right.
So if you're going to risk that, why? You better know why, And right. that I think is the main issue that folks run into with filmmakers when changes are made without any consideration as to the cost. So if you're just making changes because you think the character should die at the end as opposed to live, why did you do that? Let's discuss that process, because huge repercussions. Whereas this, I feel like it's very thoughtful. I can see why they thought to do that and why they thought that would work and what fun they had doing that and where that led to in those moments. And I didn't like that one, but that kind of worked. And, the process feels more thorough here. And Corey and I were saying before we even started, like, how funny this is to us too, because we've been doing, what is this, 39, you said?
39 episodes, yeah.
We still both feel like we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah,
like this
yeah.
Is
it's like at some point we're going to have to stop just with this superficial analysis and really stop and dig in carefully, right? Yeah.
Like we really will have to, like, cite some theory at some point, but, like, this is plenty for us to just get a start on. So we got decades. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
We put a pin in that one.
Yeah. Oh, Larry, we'll get there. Denethor. Yeah, we got to talk about the Denethor.
We have to talk about Denethor, Faramir, Boromir thing.
That'll be a topic. Yeah.
I also want to talk about it a little bit in relation to Rings of Power, because I feel like the Numenor Gondor thing is real cool when you have the Peter Jackson visuals in your mind as well. So I want to play with that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Don't worry, we'll get there.
We'll get there. We'll totally get there.
And then we're going to talk about architecture, and then we're going to talk about animals, and then we're going to talk about costumes.
It's going to be good. It's going to be good. All right. We're coming to, when we're past the end of our time, actually. So things are going to be a little bit unusual the next 2 weeks. Maggie, you're traveling for the next couple of weeks.
Away.
So
I'm in the
we'll be without
for the
you
next 2 weeks. So
for the next 2 weeks. I think what we'll do is while Maggie's gone, so one of this two, I can't do the 20th either. So the week after next will be off. Next week, I might do a special solo episode, because now this is contingent. This is contingent on personal situations. I would really love to talk about the D&D film that is out in theaters right now. I've been an avid Dungeons and Dragons player since I was in high school. Love D&D, and I know it very, very well. So this is to me a fascinating adaptation moment, especially raising the question, like, so what is exactly being adapted?
Right.
What is the source text here? In what sense is this a D&D movie and not just another fantasy movie, right?
I know, and when I come back, I want to be able to at least have a quick chat about narrative of game versus narrative of film, and how that works, because that's real interesting. But I'm not a D&D person. I'm married to one, but and I think the whole construct of the story is really fitting to a lot of the things that we look at here on Other Minds and Hoods anyway. So I'm sad I'm missing it, but Corey can most definitely hold his own better than I can on that one. So
so we'll talk about that. I say
next week.
What it's contingent on, of course, is my getting a chance to see the movie between now and then.
Goals.
I think there's goals. Exactly. There's a certain upswelling of sentiment in my household, as I am not the only avid D&D player in my family. So this will probably be able to happen. But so assuming I am able, in fact, to get myself to the theaters and see the D&D film between now and next Thursday, then I will plan to have an initial discussion about the D&D film as, again, a truly fascinating project in adaptation. So we'll talk about that next week, and then we'll be off the week after that on the 20th of April. And then Maggie and I will be back after that. So.
And I feel like to really mix it up when we come back, we should talk about the Barbie movie for like 10 minutes.
Okay.
That's when I feel like I'm writing a paper on soon. The ad campaign is phenomenal.
Right.
Anyway, so you will not see me for a couple weeks, but I will catch up with Corey's episode on YouTube later and see you guys when I'm back.
Cool.
In a new house. Yay!
Here we go. You'll be in the...
Maybe I'll have found my ring light and my microphone and...
You mean your equipment might be out of boxes by then? Who knows?
Maybe, but that seems really ambitious. I don't know. I've got a U.S. trip in the middle of that.
Right.
All right.
Exactly. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, gang.
We will see you guys again soon. Bye now.
Bye.